Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive here on Occult Archives. You know the drill. We take these infamous, feared books from history, and we crack them open to see what's really inside.
I love the way you put that. And this week is a big one. The ideas have definitely gotten under my skin while I was preparing.
I feel that already. This time it's Studies in Occultism by H.P. Blavatsky, right?
You got it. It's a collection, really.
Ah, okay. So a bunch of her articles.
Exactly, from the late 1800s. But together, they lay out a pretty comprehensive vision.
Of what? Like, what's the core focus here?
Well, a lot of things, but I think you could say it boils down to this. What is occultism? How is it different from other related ideas? And then she really tries to map out a path for people, you know?
A pass for those who want to get into this stuff, you mean?
Right. And not just casually interested, but really seeking deeper understanding.
And transformation, too, right? That's a big theme in the title itself, inner transformation.
Huge. It's not just about knowledge. It's about changing yourself deeply.
Yeah, she's definitely not messing around. And already in the first few pages, she makes a pretty sharp distinction between being a theosophist and a practicing occultist. It's not just semantics, is it? Like, they're two different paths entirely.
Totally different. So for Blavatsky, theosophy, that's almost like intellectual and ethical.
Okay, so like someone who loves truth. Is that what she means?
Absolutely. Someone driven by that, a selfless nature, and a real interest in those big metaphysical questions.
Got it. So someone who's really trying to understand the universe and how to live a good life. But when she switches over to talk about practical occultism, things get a lot more serious, right? It's not just thinking about stuff anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Practical occultism, for her, it's not just about understanding. It's you're working with forces, hidden forces, that is.
Which can be dangerous, I imagine.
That's the key point, right? Good and evil. This isn't a game. It's a path where you can gain real power, and that's where the responsibility comes in. Big time.
I can see that. And she really lays down the law about the teacher's role in all of this. It's pretty daunting, the responsibility she's talking about.
You know, it's wild. She actually says that in practical occultism, the teacher takes on, like, the karmic burden of the student.
Seriously, what does that even mean?
It's pretty intense, right? She's talking about their occult-related, like, missteps, their sins, if you will.
So anything the student messes up, it falls on the teacher.
Until the student reaches a certain level of initiation, that is, it's a lot to carry. To illustrate this, Blavatsky uses the example of godparents. You know how they kind of symbolically bear some responsibility for a child.
Yeah, for their spiritual well-being.
Exactly. So it's like that, but even more intense. Because this bond between the teacher and the student in occultism, it's super profound, but also potentially very risky.
Right, and that's probably why she's so adamant about the 7-year probation period for Taylor.
Oh, absolutely. Those are the students of occultism. And yeah, 7 years is a long time.
It's like a serious commitment.
Total commitment. And for Blavatsky, this is crucial. This whole testing and development period is there to make sure that the student can actually handle it. You know, the occult knowledge and the power.
Makes sense. Otherwise, someone could get seriously hurt. Or hurt others, too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's about preventing harm to themselves and to others. That's why this whole thing is taken so seriously.
And this whole idea of magic, Blavatsky seems pretty clear that she sees that differently from true occultism.
You're right. She's definitely not into, like, the magic tricks kind of thing.
Yeah, not parlay tricks.
No, for her, magic is often focused on manipulating the physical world.
Oh, okay. So, like, trying to make something happen.
Yeah. And she says it appeals to what she calls the animal soul. That's our lower nature, more instinctual.
Gotcha. But true occultism, that's working on a different level then.
For sure. The aims are different. The principles are totally different.
Interesting. And then she's got this whole thing about the difference between occultism and the occult arts, right? This is where people can get really tripped up.
So true. A lot of people mix these up, even people who are really into, like, theosophy and all that. Blavatsky even says that.
Really?
Yeah, they think that occultism is the same as, you know, the various occult sciences or magic.
And black magic, too.
She specifically mentions that, and it drives her crazy because there's this huge misunderstanding about how to gain real occult power, you know.
Oh, yeah. People always think of secret spells, instant power, all that stuff.
Right, like finding a master in a cave or something.
Yeah.
Going to India and you're suddenly a master.
It's so silly.
And Blavatsky, she is not having it. She's very clear that it's not that easy. And she gets into, like, specific practices. She's really trying to correct these misconceptions.
Interesting. What kind of practices?
Well, for instance, spirit conjuring. She says that's not it. or ceremonial magic. People think that's the same as the ancient wisdom, like what the Arhats practiced. But she's like, no way. And to make these distinctions even clearer, she actually uses Sanskrit terms. And she puts Atmavidya, which means knowledge of the soul, at the top. That's the best path, she says, the ethical one. You're focusing on inner understanding, spiritual growth, not going after power.
Okay, so it sounds like there are different types of occult knowledge, but some are more about seeking power, and that can lead to trouble.
Exactly. And she even gives examples like voodoos, dugpus. She's saying a lot of Westerners who think they're into occultism are actually on their way to sorcery.
Wow, that's a pretty harsh statement.
Yeah.
But she must have her reasons for saying that. She doesn't seem like the type to just throw those kinds of words around lightly.
Right. It goes back to that difference between magic and occultism. She even uses this really striking analogy to explain it. She says occultism is like the sun and magic is like a rushlight.
A rush light.
Yeah, like a little dim candle, you know.
Right.
It's a good image, right? Occultism is huge, eternal, life-giving. It represents the spirit of man. And magic is, well, it's temporary, it's flickering, it's connected to the physical body.
I see. So it's about where your focus is. If you're focused on the material world, you're going to end up with a very different kind of result than if you're reaching for something higher. It makes you realize how important it is to really understand what you're getting into before you start messing around with this stuff.
That's Blavatsky's point, for sure.
Yeah.
And she also talks about how our Western languages don't really have the right words for all of this. You know, they just can't capture all those subtle meanings.
I can see that,
Yeah.
especially compared to languages like Sanskrit, where they've been thinking about this stuff for centuries.
Right. Exactly. That's why she uses those Sanskrit terms. She breaks it down into 4 different categories.
Interesting.
So the first one is Yajna Vidya. And that's, well, it's about occult powers that are awakened through ceremonies and rituals.
Like religious rituals.
Exactly. And then there's Mahavidya, which literally means great knowledge.
But there's a catch.
Always a catch. She says this includes, like, Kabbalistic and Tantric magic, and it's the kind of knowledge that can easily lead to sorcery.
Okay, so powerful but dangerous. Got it.
And then we got Guhya Vidya.
Guhya.
Yeah, that's all about the power of sound, like literally the mystical power of sound.
Oh, interesting.
It's about vibrations.
Yeah.
And, well, in occultism, they believe that the universe, it's made up of these vibrations, these sound frequencies, and this Guhya Vidya, it's about how to work with those.
So like mantras and stuff.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. And then, well, the fourth one, Blavatsky says this is the most important for someone who's really serious about this path. It's called Atmavidya.
Atmavidya, what does that mean?
It means knowledge of the soul. And for her, this is true wisdom.
And that's what she thinks theosophists should focus on.
Absolutely. She says a wise and unselfish theosophist, this is the path they should be following.
Okay, so it sounds like we've got a lot of different paths here. But the one that leads to real wisdom, the one that's about true inner transformation, that's Atmavidya. And all these occult arts, you know, like alchemy and astrology and all that, where do they fit into all of this?
Good question. Blavatsky, she actually says that those are legitimate areas of study.
Really?
Yeah, because they explore, well, the hidden side of nature, like the energies within nature.
That's pretty cool. So is she saying that anyone who practices astrology is on the path to true wisdom?
Not necessarily, because
Yeah.
she's very clear that anyone can dabble in these things, but, well, you need moral and spiritual development, too.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just messing around with forces you don't understand.
Which can be dangerous, right? We talked about that.
Huge danger.
Mhm.
And she called out some specific examples, too. She mentions, like, voodoos, dugpus.
Those are pretty intense.
Right, and she even compares some of these practices to, like, vivisectionists.
Vivisectionists, like scientists who experiment on animals.
Yeah, and also what she calls diplomated hypnotizers.
That's a loaded term.
For sure. She's making a point. She's saying, look, knowledge without wisdom, it can be really destructive, especially when it's driven by selfish desires.
So even something like hypnotism, which we often think of as a tool of psychology or even medicine, she's saying it can be used for dark purposes.
Absolutely. If it's not guided by a deeper understanding of the forces at work, it can easily become a tool of manipulation.
This is giving me chills, and it makes me think about all the times I've heard people say, I'm so fascinated by the occult, you know, almost like it's a trend or a hobby.
Yeah, it's trendy. But Blavatsky, she's talking about a deep inner unrest that can lead someone to this path. It's not just curiosity. It's like a yearning for something more.
A yearning, right.
Right.
That's a good way to put it.
And for those people, she's saying, well, be careful. Don't let those passions and desires lead you astray. Aspire modestly. Study philosophy, the science of the soul.
So become a better person first before you try to become some kind of like supernatural wizard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Become a benefactor of humanity without needing to have, superhuman powers.
And that's really what true occultism is all about, right? It's about transcending the self.
That's the core of it. The great renunciation of self, she calls it.
Wow.
Yeah, it's about living for the world, not for yourself. That's real power, in her view.
I feel like I'm already getting a crash course in ethics here. And this whole idea of letting go of the self, that kind of leads into her next point about personal attachments, doesn't it?
It totally does. That's the next barrier she talks about.
And it sounds like it can be a pretty tough one, right? Because she's saying that even, like the love we feel for our families, it can be an obstacle.
Yeah. She's saying that anything that gets in the way of this this great renunciation, it can hold you back.
Even love.
It's pretty radical, right? But she's saying that those strong attachments, and especially those animal passions, they create disharmony. And that can mess with your occult study.
So what she's saying, like celibacy or something?
No, not necessarily that. It's about being in control. She talks about the astral body and how it gets pulled down by earthly desires.
The astral body, like our energy body.
Exactly. And for her to really connect with your higher self, you got to get rid of those passions. And the ego, the personal self.
I see. So it's about becoming detached from everything that's holding you back.
Right. It's about purity and focus.
But families, that's tough. It's supposed to be the purest kind of love, right?
Well, that's what we usually think. But Blavatsky, she's saying, well, even family love, it can be selfish.
Selfish how?
Because you're prioritizing a small group of people over everyone else. And that goes against this idea of universal love.
Oh, okay. So you can't really serve two masters.
Exactly. You have to choose the life of the world or the life of occultism.
Yeah.
And she's very clear. You can't have both.
No wonder they call this the secret doctrine. It sounds pretty demanding.
It is. And she even warns that if you try to combine the two, you'll fall.
Fall how?
From the spiritual realm into the material. You'll lose that spiritual discernment, that clarity.
And she uses that analogy of the Dead Sea fruit.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. Looks beautiful, but when you bite into it, it's just ashes.
So you're saying pursuing occultism with the wrong intentions is like that. It's tempting, but ultimately disappointing.
Exactly. It can even have karmic consequences. Blavatsky says that even if you do sorcery unintentionally, unconsciously.
There are still consequences.
Yep. You can influence others in a negative way, and that comes back to you.
So you can't just plead ignorance like, oh, I didn't mean to do that.
Nope. Intention matters, but it's not the only thing. And she contrasts this with what she calls natural-born magicians.
Natural-born magicians? That sounds pretty cool. Who are they?
Well, they're the ones who are just passion-proof. They don't have those strong personal desires that most people have. They're they're only moved by the needs of humanity.
So they're kind of like saints, almost.
Yeah, you could say that. But for the rest of us who have, past karma, attachments.
Yeah, we're not exactly saints.
She warns that the golden gate of wisdom, it can become a trap.
A trap? How?
Well, it can turn into a path of destruction, especially if you're practicing the occult arts for selfish reasons.
Oh, I see. So without that ethical foundation of Atmavidya, things can get really twisted.
Exactly. And she blames a lot of the problems in the West on the Kali Yuga.
The Kali Yuga.
That's like a dark age, spiritually speaking.
Oh, right.
And she says it makes people really vulnerable to all kinds of negativity and delusions.
So what kind of delusions?
Well, for one, this idea that you can just jump into occultism, no problem, no sacrifices required.
Right, like it's a get-rich-quick scheme or something. Just buy a few crystals and you're good to go.
Yeah, exactly. And Blavatsky is very clear that that's not how it works at all. It requires serious dedication, self-awareness, and most of all, a realistic understanding of what you're getting into.
Okay, so far so good. But then she takes this really interesting turn and starts talking about black magic and science. And she's particularly interested in hypnotism and mesmerism, right? So I have to say, that's a pretty unexpected connection.
I know, right? But when you really think about it, it makes sense.
How so?
Well, she's basically saying that these are all different aspects of the same fundamental force.
The same force that drives magic.
Exactly. Whether it's used for good or for evil, it all comes from the same source. And she traces these ideas back to ancient times. She talks about the Phrygian dactyls and the breath of Cybele.
The breath of Cybele, that's...
Well, think of it as like the original life force, the
Mhm.
energy that animates everything.
Okay, I can kind of see where she's going with this.
And she's saying that the same force, it's been known by different names throughout history, like theurgic magic, mesmerism, and now hypnotism.
So it's always been there, just dressed up in different clothes, so to speak.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Blavatsky thinks that science has been ignoring this whole aspect of reality. She calls it antediluvian mesmerism, and she's pretty critical of the way science has dismissed it as, like, superstition.
Because it doesn't fit neatly into their little boxes.
Right. They're so focused on the material world that they miss the bigger picture. And she argues that this is actually a really dangerous attitude. Because magic, whether it's white magic or black magic, it's real, it's powerful, and it's not going away just because science chooses to ignore it.
I see. So she's saying that by dismissing these supernatural phenomena, science is actually making them more dangerous because they're operating without any real understanding or control.
Exactly. And this brings us to the whole hypnotism versus mesmerism debate, which was pretty heated back in her day.
I've heard of that. Wasn't Mesmer like a rock star in Paris for a while?
He totally was. People were flocking to his clinics, I guess you could call them. But then the Academy of Science stepped in. They investigated him. Even Benjamin Franklin was involved. And they basically discredited him.
Even though people were claiming to be healed by his methods.
Yep. Blavatsky points out that there was a lot of anecdotal evidence, but the scientists weren't impressed. They wanted hard proof,
And they couldn't find any.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Blavatsky thinks that they were looking in the wrong places. They were so focused on the material aspects of it that they missed the real power, which is operating on a subtler level.
So she's basically saying that Mesmer was onto something real, even if science couldn't explain it at the time.
Right. And it's interesting because, well, hypnotism is now widely accepted.
Yeah, it's used in therapy and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Blavatsky, she was already warning about the potential dangers of hypnotism way back then.
Really? So she was ahead of her time on that one.
She totally was.
Yeah?
She saw hypnotism as almost a degeneration of mesmerism.
How so?
Well, she thought that mesmerism, when done properly, it could be really beneficial. It could even help people develop morally and spiritually.
But hypnotism was more like...
More like manipulation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. She saw hypnotism as this, almost a violation of free will.
Because the person being hypnotized becomes so suggestible.
Exactly. They're like a blank slate. And the hypnotist can implant whatever ideas they want.
And she thinks that's dangerous.
Hugely dangerous. She even compares it to, like, black magic.
Seriously, hypnotism as black magic.
It's pretty radical, right? But she has a point. Think about it. If you can control someone's mind, you can make them do anything.
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
And she even gives examples of crimes that were committed under hypnotic influence.
Wow. This is all starting to sound like a sci-fi thriller.
I know, right? But Blavatsky, she's deadly serious about this stuff. She's trying to warn people about the potential dangers of these occult forces, whether they're being used intentionally or unintentionally.
And she's saying that science is playing with fire by messing around with these things without a deeper understanding of what they're really dealing with.
For sure. She's basically saying, look, you guys are holding one key to occultism, the material key, but you're ignoring the other half, the psychic and spiritual side. And that's really dangerous.
Because it's like driving a car with only one foot on the pedal.
Right.
You're going to lose control.
Exactly. You need both feet, the material and the spiritual, working together in harmony.
Okay, so that's hypnotism and mesmerism. But then she gets into this whole other topic, which is psychic and noetic action. And it sounds like this is where she really starts to outline her own model of how the mind and consciousness actually work.
Oh, yeah. This is where things get really interesting.
And in what way?
Well, she's basically saying that occultists have a very different understanding of psychology than the mainstream scientists.
Because they recognize the spiritual dimension.
Exactly. And she says that this is where the confusion comes in. Because everyone's using the same words, but they mean different things.
Like the word psychic.
Right. For a scientist, psychic just refers to the nervous system and, brain activity. But for an occultist, it's so much more than that.
I see. It's about those hidden forces we were talking about earlier, those energies that science can't really measure.
Exactly. And then she goes on to make this really important distinction between mind and soul.
I was wondering about that. I've always thought of them as kind of the same thing.
Well, most people do.
Yeah.
But Blavatsky, she's very specific about this. She says that mind is the rational spiritual part of us. It's connected to the Greek word pneuma.
Pneuma, like...
breath. Yeah, like the breath of life. but it's also about intelligence, about reason.
Okay, so that's mind. And what about soul?
Well, for her, soul is the vital principle. It's what animates us, what gives us life. It's the Greek word psyche.
Psyche, like psychology.
Right, so it's a different kind of energy than mind. It's more about feeling, about instinct.
Interesting. So she's basically saying that we have two minds, in a way. A higher mind and a lower mind.
Exactly. And this is where it gets even more complex because, well, she says that physiologists, they only really study the lower mind.
Because that's all they can see.
Exactly. They're focused on the senses, the appetites, all that stuff that we share with animals.
But they're missing the bigger picture.
Exactly. They're missing the higher intellectual and spiritual faculties that make us truly human.
Okay. So she's basically saying that science is only studying half of the human experience. And that's why they can't really understand things like psychic phenomena.
For sure. They're missing the spiritual key.
This is amazing. It's like a whole new way of looking at psychology.
Right. It's pretty revolutionary, actually. And she even goes on to say that this whole modern concept of psychology, it's too limited. It only focuses on the nervous system and molecular action.
Yeah, that's way too narrow.
Right. It ignores the higher noetic character of the mind.
The noetic character.
Yeah, that's the spiritual dimension, basically. And she says that theosophy, well, it's more aligned with Eastern philosophies on this point. They recognize the importance of the noetic realm.
That's really interesting. So she's pulling from different traditions, both Western and Eastern, to create this more comprehensive model of the mind.
Exactly. She's trying to bridge those gaps, And she even references this editorial that she wrote called The Dual Aspect of Wisdom.
The dual aspect of wisdom?
Yeah, she's talking about the difference between, well, what she calls devilish terrestrial wisdom versus wisdom from above.
So it's that duality again, right?
It's everywhere. And she
Yeah.
brings in all these fascinating examples to illustrate her point. Like, did you know that ancient Hindus believe that every cell has consciousness?
No, but it kind of makes sense when you think about it.
Right. And there's this professor, Professor Ladd, who used the term supersensible beings to describe atoms.
Super sensible beings. That's wild. Like, they have their own awareness.
Exactly. And occultism takes it even further. They say that every atom is like a mini universe, and every cell has its own brain, its own memory, its own experiences.
So we're not just made up of matter, we're made up of consciousness.
That's the key point. And she says that science is starting to catch up to this idea. They're finding more and more evidence that memory is not just located in the brain.
Really?
Yeah, they're finding it in all sorts of organs, in every cell of the body.
That's amazing. It really challenges our whole understanding of how memory works.
It totally does. And Blavatsky, she's saying, well, if you limit memory to the brain, you're limiting the universal mind. You're limiting the influence of the Manasaputra.
And Manasaputra, those are...
They're like the divine beings who, well, they're kind of like the guardians of humanity, you could say. And she says that they work through our higher minds, through our intuition.
So she's tying all of this back to the spiritual realm.
Always. And then she gets into this whole philosophical discussion about consciousness itself. How do you even define it? What is it, really? And she's basically saying, look, you can either listen to the people who have direct experience of these things, the seers, or you can listen to the people who deny their existence.
And who is she siding with?
Well, she's definitely on the side of the seers. And she's saying that occult physiology, well, it has an answer to this question of consciousness. They say that there's this immortal divine mind within each of us, which they call nous.
Nous. That's a new one for me.
It's basically the source of our consciousness, the ultimate source. And she says that this divine mind, it reflects itself in our everyday mind, in our intellect.
Okay, I'm following.
And then she says that there are two sources of memory. The physical brain, which records external impressions, and the inner consciousness, the noetic principle, which holds the deeper, more spiritual memories.
So two kinds of memory, two minds. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But it's all connected. She's showing us how the psychic and noetic forces interact. The psychic works from the outside in, the noetic from the inside out.
Okay, so it's like a two-way street with energy flowing in both directions.
Exactly. And she uses this analogy. She says the physical body is like a covering for our inner spiritual principles. And the cell is like, well, it's the body of those immaterial atoms. It's amazing, right?
Yeah, it's like those Russian nesting dolls. You keep opening them up, and there's always another one inside.
Exactly. And she says that the activity of the cell is determined by these inner or outer forces, the noetic or the psychic. So it all comes back to that duality again. And she even goes on to say that atoms themselves, well, they're not just physical particles, they're psycho-spiritual units.
So they have consciousness, too.
For sure. They're not just mindless matter, they're alive.
Yeah.
They have their own laws, their own intelligence. It's a whole different way of looking at the universe, right?
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing.
I know. And then she gets into this whole metaphor about like a keyboard. She says that our organs and cells, they have this keyboard that's constantly registering sensations.
Okay.
And then the artist, which is, well, it's the unity of our physical and spiritual being. It can either play a harmonious melody in those keys, or it can create disharmony. It's a beautiful image, right?
It is. It's like we're all instruments, and it's up to us to learn how to play the right music.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she's saying that the wisdom from above, the noetic influence, it leads to divine actions. But the terrestrial devilish wisdom, the psychic influence,
Yeah.
well, that leads to